The studio crackled with anticipation the moment Clint Eastwood stepped onto the set of The View. At 94, he moved with the same controlled presence that had defined his decades-long career. Calm, steady, unbothered by the cameras or the sea of phones pointed at him. Dressed in a clean, perfectly fitted navy suit, he gave the audience a single nod, and they answered with roaring applause. Before we begin, tell us where are you watching from, also subscribe. Sitting across from him was Joy Behar, already leaning forward with the look of someone preparing for a fight rather than an interview. Her glasses caught the light, but it was the sharpness in her eyes that set the tone. Everyone in the room knew Joy loved confrontation, and today she seemed eager for a full-scale clash. "Clint Eastwood," she said, voice dripping with dry humor. "Welcome to our table. We don't usually get cowboys around here." Clint offered a polite half-smile. "Figured it was time to visit the ranch," he replied in that gravelly voice, prompting a warm chuckle from the audience. Joy didn't join in. She was already reaching for her first strike. "You've built a career playing men who solve problems with guns and grit. Don't you think it's time to hand the reins to younger storytellers? Maybe Hollywood has had enough of your type." Clint's expression barely moved, though a subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed a flicker of irritation. "My type," he echoed. "You mean someone who works hard, tells stories people care about, and doesn't talk down to them? Seems to me the audience doesn't mind." A few claps rose before Joy waved a dismissive hand. "Come on, Clint. You've been relying on the same squint and six-shooter persona since the 60s. Isn't it getting old?" Clint tilted his head, studying her like a man measuring wind speed before firing a shot. His voice stayed calm. "Funny thing about stories that last 60 years. They're called classics. People still watch them because they matter." The audience reacted with a quick cheer, and Joy visibly bristled. She wasn't backing down. She flipped one of her cards dramatically. "Let's talk about Million Dollar Baby." Some critics, myself included, said it was overrated. Just another testosterone-fueled project from you. A boxing movie? Really? Clint sat back, hands resting calmly in his lap. "That little project won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture," he said dryly. "Not too bad for an old cowboy, wouldn't you say?" Laughter burst from the audience, but Joy pushed on over the noise. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. Hollywood hands trophies to men like you for telling the same story over and over. Where's the originality? Where's the progress? Do you even care what younger viewers want anymore?" Clint didn't move. His stillness alone silenced the room more than Joy's voice ever could. When he finally spoke, he kept his tone low and steady. "You're confusing trends with substance. Trends fade fast. Good stories don't. Maybe you'd understand that if you spent less time shouting and more time paying attention." A ripple of shock spread through the audience. Even a couple of Joy's co-hosts exchanged uncertain glances, but Joy leaned back with a tight, sarcastic smile. "Right, so now I'm supposed to listen to a man whose movies glorify violence and macho fantasy. A man who teaches audiences that bullets and fists solve everything." Clint leaned forward, meeting her glare with that unmistakable Eastwood stare, the one that had frozen villains and commanded entire theaters into silence. "My films," he said slowly, "aren't about glorifying violence. They're about choices, consequences, responsibility, things people like, even if you pretend not to." The room was quiet enough to hear cameras humming. Joy opened her mouth, but Clint continued before she could speak. "I've spent my life telling stories about flawed people trying to do the right thing in a complicated world. If you only see guns and grit, maybe that says more about what you look for than what I create." The audience erupted, some clapping, some gasping, all electrified by the exchange. Joy's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of frustration she couldn't quite hide. Clint, meanwhile, simply leaned back again, calm as ever, letting the moment settle, and in that instant it was clear to everyone watching, pushing a man like Clint Eastwood too far didn't ignite sparks. It unleashed a wildfire. The air in the studio felt different now, thicker, tighter, charged with something far beyond the usual daytime TV tension. Even the camera operators seemed to steady their hands, sensing they were capturing a moment that would be replayed endlessly. Joy Behar straightened her cards, though her fingers trembled just enough for the front row to notice. Clint Eastwood, on the other hand, looked as composed as a man sitting on his own porch at sunset. Age hadn't softened him. If anything, it had chiseled away every unnecessary motion, leaving nothing but pure intent. "So that's your defense?" Joy asked, her voice thinner than before. "You make violent movies for the sake of what? Moral lessons? Clint's eyes narrowed, not angrily, but as if he were trying to read small print on a distant page. No, he said. I make movies about people, and people aren't perfect. Some fight, some break, some get up again, but I don't hide that truth to make anyone comfortable. Joy forced a scoff, but it didn't land. Truth? Clint, you're living in the past. Audiences want something different now, something fresher. Clint leaned forward slightly. Fresh doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means untested, and when you've lived long enough, you learn the difference. A murmur rippled through the audience, not of shock this time, but agreement. Seeing that, Joy's posture sharpened defensively. All right, she said with pointed calm. Let's talk about your age. 94, most people slow down. You're still directing films, jumping into projects, trying to stay relevant. Why? What keeps you going? Fear of fading away? The question hung in the room like a loaded weapon. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. Even one of Joy's co-hosts opened her mouth to intervene, but Clint lifted a hand gently, signaling he had it under control. Fear? Clint repeated. I've outlived fear. I work because I love what I do, because stories still matter to me, and because as long as I can think clearly and stand on my own 2 feet, I don't owe the world an apology for being alive and useful. Joy blinked, caught off guard by the directness. Clint continued before she could recover. If you're trying to suggest a man should stop contributing just because he's older, maybe you should think about what that says about your own views on people, not mine. A wave of applause broke out, louder this time, sustained, undeniable. Joy's jaw tightened. This wasn't the direction she'd expected the segment to go. She shuffled her cards again, searching for a note, a quote, anything. Clint, she said, trying to regain footing. You act like you're some sage, but you've made mistakes. Plenty of them. Don't you think there's value in listening to the younger generation's perspective? Of course, Clint said calmly, but listening doesn't mean letting them erase the past. I've seen generations rise and fall. Every one of them arrives thinking they're the first to understand the world. Eventually they learn they're part of a bigger story. He paused, then added, if they're willing to listen. The audience reacted again, some with soft gasps, others with thoughtful nods. Joy, growing visibly irritated, tried one last angle. So you're saying the younger generation is wrong? Clint shook his head. I'm saying they don't have to be right all the time, and neither do I, but I've earned the right to speak without being dismissed just for existing longer than someone else. Joy's co-host Sunny leaned in, sensing the moment needed grounding. Clint, she asked gently, do you ever feel the pressure to change your style to fit modern expectations? Clint looked at her, and for the first time since sitting down, his expression softened. Pressure? Sure, but I don't follow it. If I try to be what the world wants this week, I become irrelevant next week. Authenticity lasts longer than approval. The entire front row let out a hum of agreement. Clint wasn't shouting, wasn't grandstanding, wasn't trying to win the moment. He simply spoke with the calm conviction of someone who'd lived long enough to understand the weight of words. Joy crossed her arms, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something between frustration and grudging respect. So, Joy said quietly, you're really not done. You still think you've got stories left to tell. Clint smiled, not a big smile, just that familiar Eastwood curve of the lips, the one that had followed him through gunfights, courtrooms, battlefields, and decades of cinema. If I wake up tomorrow, he said, and my mind's sharp and my heart's still in it, then yes, I'm not done, not by a long shot. For a beat, the room was silent. Then applause. Loud, rising, rolling through the studio like a wave. Even some of the crew clapped. Joy looked around, realizing she had lost the battle. Not because she wasn't sharp, not because she wasn't bold, but because Clint Eastwood was something far rarer. Unshakable. He didn't gloat. He didn't jab back. He simply sat there, still and solid, like a monument carved from time itself. And at that moment, everyone in the studio, whether they loved him, doubted him, or came in skeptical, understood exactly why you never poke a lion unless you're ready for the roar. The applause eventually faded, but the energy it left behind stayed suspended in the air like dust caught in a spotlight. Joy Behar shifted in her chair, trying to reclaim control of the segment, but the momentum had slipped from her fingers. Clint Eastwood hadn't just responded to her challenges, he had reshaped the entire atmosphere of the studio with a few calm, razor-sharp sentences. All right, Joy said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Let's shift gears. But even her attempt at a reset carried an edge. You've had a long career, Clint. Very long. Some would say too long. When is enough enough? When do you finally hang it up? Clint didn't bristle. He didn't even blink. He simply rested his elbows on the armrests and looked at Joy with the patience of a man who had weathered 1,000 storms and wasn't intimidated by one more gust of wind. Enough, he said, is whenever I stop loving what I do, not when someone else decides it for me. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Some people retire because they're tired. Some because they've run out of passion. I haven't. Joy opened her mouth, but Clint continued, voice steady as granite. You know, Joy, people spend too much time worrying about what others should or shouldn't be doing. I've always believed in letting people live their own lives without trying to cut them down to size. His eyes softened just a fraction. Even if they're a loudmouth on morning television. The audience erupted in laughter. Joy's eyebrows shot up, stunned that he had actually said it aloud, but the laughter drowned any immediate retaliation she might have had. Before she could respond, Whoopi Goldberg, who had been watching the exchange with amused, wary interest, finally spoke up. Clint, she said with a half smile, you know Joy's not gonna let you leave here without a fight, right? Clint turned to her, his expression easing. I know, he said, but I've been in tougher ones. The audience clapped again, and Whoopi grinned. Joy tried to reassert herself. Well, since you're so tough, she said, why don't we talk politics? You've made some, let's say, controversial stances over the years. A murmur swept through the audience, half excitement, half dread. Even the producers behind the cameras stiffened. They knew political landmines when they heard them. Clint, however, remained unmoved. You can ask, he said. Doesn't mean you'll like the answer. Joy leaned forward, sensing an opening. Do you ever regret the things you've said or the positions you've taken, especially now that the world's changed so much? Clint's response came without hesitation. If I regret anything, he said, it's not what I believed. It's the times I didn't say what I should have because I didn't feel like hearing the noise afterward. He shrugged lightly, but life's too short to live it apologizing for what you think. Joy made a small, exasperated sound, but the audience responded with approving murmurs. Clint's words weren't flashy, but they were grounded, and people felt that. Joy straightened, her expression turning sharper. So you're saying you wouldn't change anything? Not a single stance? Clint sighed, not dramatically, but like a teacher patiently correcting a student. Joy, I'm saying I've lived long enough to know that certainty is a luxury young people cling to because they haven't been tested yet. I've changed my mind plenty in life, but not because someone yelled loud enough. A hush fell again, soft, thoughtful. Even Joy seemed momentarily at a loss. She glanced at her cards, then set them aside entirely, realizing the script was useless now. The conversation had become something raw and unplanned. Clint, she said in a quieter tone, do you ever wish you could go back? Not to change things, but just to feel younger again? That question surprised everyone, including Clint. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands as if considering his lifetime in their wrinkles. When he looked up, his voice was softer. Youth is loud, he said. Fast, reckless, but wisdom is quiet. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. I've had my youth. I've had my middle years. Now I have this. He gestured toward the room, the lights, the audience leaning in. And honestly, I wouldn't trade where I am now for going back. It was the most vulnerable thing he'd said all morning. Even Joy seemed taken aback. The audience didn't clap this time. They didn't want to break the moment, Clint continued. People think getting older means losing things, but you also gain things you can't get any other. Way, perspective, peace, the freedom to stop chasing every noise and focus on what matters. Joy's expression softened, just slightly, almost unwillingly. And what matters to you now? She asked. Clint gave her a gentle, knowing smile. Doing good work, living quietly, appreciating whatever time I have left without wasting it on nonsense. He lifted a brow, including arguments that don't go anywhere. The audience laughed again, and even Joy cracked a reluctant smile. She knew he'd won, not by overpowering her, but by outlasting her, by being unshakably, undeniably himself. The segment wrapped shortly after, the show's theme music swelling as the cameras panned out, but the energy lingered. Everyone in the studio, from audience members to co-hosts to the crew wearing headsets, felt they had witnessed something rare, an interview where the guest didn't just survive the pressure, he owned it. As the applause faded and the lights dimmed for the commercial break, Joy leaned slightly toward Clint, barely audible to the microphones. You're tougher than you look, she muttered. Clint smirked. You have no idea. And as he stood steady and unhurried, it became clear once more, some legends don't need to roar to be feared, they only need to speak. As Clint rose from his chair, the studio audience began buzzing again, sensing that even though the cameras had cut away, the moment wasn't truly over. His presence carried a gravity that didn't vanish with the end of a segment. It lingered, reshaping the air around him. Joy Behar remained seated for a moment longer than usual, watching him with an expression that flickered between frustration, admiration, and something she'd never admit, a hint of respect. One of the stagehands approached Clint to guide him off the set, but he waved the young man off with a polite nod. He walked on his own, steady and sure, moving with the deliberate confidence of someone who refused to let the world decide when he should slow down. As he stepped away from the table, several members of the audience reached out, hoping for a handshake or even a nod in their direction. Clint gave them both, small gestures, but powerful enough to send murmurs rippling through the seats. Behind him, Joy pushed herself up and followed, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was unfinished business, or maybe deep down she felt the need to confront something she hadn't expected to face today, her own limits. "Clint," she called quietly, careful not to let her mic pick it up. He paused, turning his head just slightly. "Yes, Joy." "You know," she said, adjusting her glasses, "it's not easy sitting across from someone who refuses to crack." Clint offered a wry half smile. "I've been called worse." Joy let out a breath somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "I wasn't trying to disrespect you," she said, words coming out slower than usual. "I push people. That's what I do. Sometimes it lands, sometimes it doesn't." Clint studied her for a moment before responding. "I can take a punch," he said, "always have, but taking one isn't the same as needing one." Joy frowned slightly, unsure of his meaning. Clint continued, voice low and even. "You swing hard because you expect everyone to swing back, but not everyone's your enemy, Joy. Some of us are just answering the questions we're given." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Whoopi walked up behind her. "He's right, you know," Whoopi said with a grin. "Sometimes you throw sparks just to see what burns." Joy shot her a look, but Clint chuckled. It was a quiet, genuine sound, surprising enough that even Joy softened. "You two make quite the duo," he said. "Duos need good guests," Whoopi replied, "and you gave us one hell of a show." Clint dipped his head in appreciation, then continued toward backstage. The hallway lights reflected off the framed posters and magazine covers featuring past guests, presidents, movie stars, authors, musicians. As Clint walked past them, it was impossible not to notice how many of those faces had come and gone while he remained a titan in his own right. A young producer jogged up beside him with an excited smile. "Mr. Eastwood, that was incredible. The control, the composure. It was like watching one of your films play out live." Clint gave her a nod. "Appreciate it." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever get tired of being, well, Clint Eastwood?" He stopped walking and looked at her with a gentle seriousness. "You don't get tired of being yourself," he said. "You just try to do it well." The producer blinked, absorbing the weight behind the simplicity of his words. Clint patted her on the shoulder and continued down the hall. Meanwhile, back on stage, Joy took her seat again as the crew prepped for the next segment. But something was different. She wasn't muttering under her breath. She wasn't flipping through her cards. She was staring at the floor, thinking. Whoopi watched her for a moment before leaning close. "He got to you," she said. Joy shook her head quickly. "He didn't get to me. I didn't expect him to be that tough or that calm." Whoopi smirked. "You tried to saddle a wild horse. He didn't buck. He just stared until you dropped the reins." Joy's shoulders slumped just a little. "You think I came off too harsh?" Whoopi shrugged. "Maybe, but you're Joy Behar. People expect fireworks." Joy sighed. "Yeah, but that man, he doesn't light fireworks. He walks through them like they're dust." The live audience filtered into small conversations, still buzzing with the raw electricity Clint had left behind. Some talked about his words. Some talked about Joy's persistence. Some talked about the stare, that iconic Eastwood stare that hadn't lost a hint of its power. Moments like these didn't happen often on daytime television. They were unscripted, uncontained, impossible to fake. If you like this video, then subscribe.